Chapter 11, The Early Years of the International. 1. The founding of the International. The International Working Men's Association was founded at a big meeting in St. Martin's Hall, London, on the 28th of September, 1864, a few weeks after Lassalle's death. It was not the work of one individual, and it was not a small body with a large head. Above all, it was neither an insignificant shadow nor a terrible menace, as it was described alternately by the fantasy of the capitalist inksling in sublime indifference to the facts. The first International was a transitional form of the proletarian struggle for emancipation, and it was as necessary as it was transitional. The capitalist mode of production, an embodied contradiction, both produces and destroys modern states. It intensifies all national antagonisms to the utmost, and at the same time it creates all nations in its own image. So long as the capitalist mode of production exists, these contradictions are insoluble. And therefore the brotherhood of man, about which all bourgeois revolutions have sung so sweetly, has suffered defeat again and again. Whilst large-scale industry preached freedom and peace between nations, it also turned the world into an armed camp as never before in history. However, with the disappearance of the capitalist mode of production, its contradictions will vanish also. It is true that the proletarian struggle for emancipation must develop on a national basis, because the capitalist process of production develops within national limits. And in the beginning, therefore, the proletariat in each country finds itself face to face with its own bourgeoisie. Despite this, however, the proletariat need not submit to the merciless competition which has always destroyed all bourgeois dreams of international peace and freedom. As soon as the workers realize that they must get rid of competition in their own ranks if they are to offer effective resistance to the superior power of capital, and this realization coincides with the first awakening of their class consciousness, then it is only a step to the deeper realization that competition between the working classes of the various countries must cease too. And still further, that the working classes must cooperate internationally if they are to overthrow the international dominance of the bourgeoisie. Very early in the history of the modern working class movement, therefore, a tendency towards internationalism made itself felt. What the bourgeoisie, thanks to the narrowing of its horizon by its profit interests, regards as unpatriotic, as ignorance and lack of understanding, is in reality a vital condition for the very existence of the proletarian struggle for emancipation. Although this struggle can solve the antagonism between nationalism and internationalism, whilst the bourgeoisie is condemned to ride under it as long as it lives, the workers possess no magic wand in this respect any more than in any other, and they are not able to turn the hard and difficult climb into a level and easy path. The modern working class has to fight its battles under conditions created by historical development. It cannot overrun these conditions in a whirlwind charge, but can triumph over them only by understanding them in the Hegelian sense that to understand is to overcome. This understanding was made more difficult owing to the circumstance that the beginnings of the working class movement, and the beginnings of internationalism in it, coincided with, crossed and recrossed, the beginnings of a number of great national states, which were being founded as a result of the capitalist mode of production. The declaration of the Communist Manifesto that united action on the part of the proletariat in all civilized countries was a necessary condition of its emancipation was followed a few weeks later by the Revolution of 1848. In England and France this revolution lined up the bourgeoisie and the proletariat against each other, but in Germany and Italy it released struggles for national independence. However, as far as the proletariat appeared in the arena as a separate force at all, it recognized quite correctly that although these struggles for national independence could not achieve its final aim, they nevertheless were a stage on the way to its achievement. The proletariat provided the national movements in Germany and Italy with their most courageous fighters, and nowhere did these movements find better advice than in the columns of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, which was issued by the authors of the Communist Manifesto. However, the national struggles naturally forced the idea of internationalism into the background, particularly when the bourgeoisie of Germany and Italy began to take refuge behind reactionary bayonets. In Italy associations of workers formed themselves under the banner of Mazzini, who, although he was no socialist, was at least a republican, whilst in Germany, which was more highly developed than Italy and whose workers had realized the international implications of their cause even in the days of Whiteling, a 10-year civil war took place around just this national question. The situation in England and France when the modern proletarian movement began was quite different, for in both these countries national unity had been achieved long before. And even before the days of the March Revolution, the idea of internationalism was very much alive. Paris was regarded as the capital of the European Revolution and London was the metropolis of the world market. But even in France and England the idea of internationalism experienced a setback after the defeats suffered by the proletariat. The terrible bloodletting of the June days exhausted the French working class, and the iron hand of Bonapartist despotism hampered both trade union and political organization. As a result, the working class movement in France fell back into the sectarianism of pre-revolutionary days, and out of its confusion two main tendencies began to develop, separating, one might say, the revolutionary and socialist elements. One of these tendencies crystallized around Blanqui, who had no real socialist program and aimed at seizing political power by the daring coup of a determined minority. The other and incomparably stronger tendency was under the intellectual influence of Proudhon, who sought to lead the workers away from the political struggle with his exchange bank scheme for the provision of free credit, and similar doctrinaire experiments. Marx had already pointed out in the 18th Brumaire that this movement abandoned all attempts to transform the old world with the tremendous means the latter offered for such purpose, whilst seeking salvation by backstair methods, by private means, and within its own limited conditions of existence. After the collapse of the Chartist movement, a process of development which was in many respects similar began in England also. The great utopian Robert Owen was still alive, though very old, and his school had degenerated into a sort of religious freethought association. Side by side with Owen's school was the Christian socialism of Kingsley and Morris, and although it must not be tarred with the same brush as its continental caricatures, it too pursued educational and cooperative aims, and refused to have anything to do with the political struggle. Even the trade unions, which England possessed in contrast to France, remained politically indifferent and confined their activities to satisfying their immediate interests, a policy which was facilitated by the feverish industrial activities of the 50s and by England's dominating position in the world market. Despite all this, the international working class movement on English territory sank only very slowly into a torpor, and its traces can be followed into the end of the 50s. The fraternal Democrats had dragged on into the days of the Crimean War, and even when they finally disappeared, an international committee was formed, and after that an international association. Thanks chiefly to the energies of Ernest Jones, these organizations were never of any great significance, but at least they showed that the idea of internationalism had not died out completely, and that its fire still glowed and might be fanned into leaping flames again by a strong breeze. This breeze sprang up in the form of the commercial crisis of 1857, the War of 1859, and in particular the Civil War which broke out between the northern and southern states in America in 1860. The commercial crisis of 1857 struck the first serious blow at Bonapartist rule in France, and the attempt to counter its effects by launching a foreign political adventure was by no means completely successful. The game which the false Bonaparte started quickly slid out of his hands. The movement for Italian unity grew too strong for him to control, whilst the French bourgeoisie showed little inclination to let itself be fobbed off with the somewhat sparse laurels of Magento and Solferino. Under the circumstances, the idea of curbing the growing insolence of the bourgeoisie by giving the working class a little more leeway was a fairly obvious one. And in fact the very existence of the Second Empire depended on Bonaparte's successful solution of the problem of playing off the bourgeoisie and the proletariat against each other whilst holding both in check. Naturally, Bonaparte intended to make only trade union concessions to the working class and not political concessions. Proudhon, who enjoyed great influence on the working class movement, was opposed to the Second Empire. Although some of his paradoxical utterances might very easily have awakened the contrary impression, but he was also an opponent of strikes. However, this was just the point on which the French workers were getting out of hand, and despite Proudhon's warnings and despite the severe anti-combination laws, no less than 909 workers were convicted from 1853 to 1866 for offences against these laws, and no less than 749 combinations were involved. The imitation Caesar then began to pardon the convicted men, and he also supported the sending of French workers to the World Exhibition in London in 1862. And it must be admitted that he did it in a much more effective and thorough fashion than did the German Nationalverein, which put the same ingenious idea into operation. The delegates were elected by their fellow workers in the same trades. 50 polling booths for 150 trades were established in Paris, and zoo delegates were elected and sent to London. the expenses of the journey being borne partly by voluntary subscription and partly by subsidies from the imperial and municipal treasuries, which contributed 20,000 francs each. On their return the delegates were permitted to publish detailed reports, and generally speaking these reports went far beyond the limits of trade affairs. Under the conditions existing in France at the time, the affair represented a first-class state action and it caused the police prefect of Paris, prophetic in his presentiments, to sigh that before the emperor went in for such experiments it would be better to abolish the anti-combination laws altogether. In fact, the French workers rewarded their self-seeking patron not in the way he expected, but in the way he deserved. During the elections of 1863 the government candidates in Paris received only 82,000 votes as against 153,000 for the candidates of the opposition. Whereas in the elections of 1857 the government candidates had received 111,000 votes and the candidates of the opposition only 96,000 votes. It was generally assumed that this was due only to a slight degree to the changed attitude of the bourgeoisie and chiefly to the changed attitude of the working class, which proclaimed its independence just at the moment when the false Bonaparte began to flirt with the workers, though it still marched under the banner of bourgeois radicalism. This assumption was confirmed by subsequent by-elections in Paris in 1864 when 60 workers put forward the metalworker Tolaine as their candidate and issued a manifesto announcing the rebirth of socialism. The socialists had learned from past experience, it declared. In 1848 the workers had possessed no clear program and had adopted this or that social theory more by instinct than deliberation. But today they rejected all utopian exaggerations and sought relief in social reforms such as the freedom of the press, the right to organize, the repeal of the anti-combination laws, compulsory free education, and the abolition of the religious budget. At the election, however, Tolaine received only a few hundred votes. Proudhon was in agreement with the contents of the manifesto but condemned the participation in the election, regarding the polling of blank ballot papers as a more effective protest against the Second Empire regime. The Blanquists found the manifesto too moderate for them, whilst the bourgeoisie in all its liberal and radical shades, with one or two exceptions, attacked Tolaine with mockery and jibes, though in reality there was nothing in his program to give them any cause for anxiety. It was a phenomenon similar to the one which was taking place at the same time in Germany. Encouraged by this, Bonaparte ventured a step further and in May, 1864, a law was passed which, although it did not withdraw the prohibition of trade unions, at least, it repealed the paragraphs of the Penal Code which provided punishments for workers convicted of joining combinations with a view to improving their working conditions. In England the anti-combination laws had been repealed in 1825, but the existence of the trade unions was still not absolutely secure either legally or actually. Whilst the masses of their members did not have the franchise which would have permitted them to abolish the legal hindrances hampering their struggle for better working conditions, the development of continental capitalism destroyed innumerable existences and created dangerous competition for the English workers in the form of sweated labor. And every time they made an attempt to secure higher wages or shorter working hours the English capitalists threatened to import cheap foreign labor power from France, Belgium, Germany and other countries. In this situation the American Civil War particularly aroused the workers. It produced a cotton crisis which caused great misery amongst the English textile workers. In this way the English trade unions were shaken out of their comfortable torpor and the new unionism developed, represented by a number of experienced leaders of the older unions. Allen of the engineers, Applegarth of the carpenters, Lucraft of the joiners, Kremer of the builders, Hodger of the shoemakers, and others. These men recognized the necessity of a political struggle on behalf of the trade unions, and they turned their attention to the question of reforming the franchise. They were the moving spirits behind a monster meeting which took place in St. James's Hall under the chairmanship of the radical leader John Bright, and registered a fierce protest against Palmerston's intention of intervening in the American Civil War on the side of the Southern states. When Garibaldi came to London on a visit in the spring of 1864 these leaders organized a tremendous reception for him. The political reawakening of the English and French working classes also revived the idea of internationalism. A fraternal celebration had taken place in 1862 at the World Exhibition in London between the English workers and the French delegates. And this bond was strengthened still further by the Polish insurrection of 1863. The Polish cause had always been extremely popular amongst the revolutionary elements in the countries of Western Europe. The oppression and dismemberment of Poland had made the three Eastern European powers into a reactionary bloc, and the restoration of Polish independence would have struck a deadly blow against Russian hegemony in Europe. The Fraternal Democrats had always celebrated the anniversary of the Polish Revolution of 1830, and these celebrations had been enthusiastic demonstrations in favor of a united and independent Poland, but always with the basic idea that the restoration of a free and democratic Poland was a necessary condition for the proletarian struggle for emancipation. This was also the case in 1863, and the social note was sounded very sharply at the celebrations which took place in London in the presence of representatives of the French workers. The social question was also at the basis of an address which a committee of English workers under the chairmanship of Odger sent to the French workers to thank them for having sent representatives to the celebrations in London, and it pointed out in particular that English capital was able to hold the English workers in check by importing sweated foreign labour, only because the working classes in the various countries had not yet established close and fraternal relations with each other. This address was translated into French by Professor Beazley, a professor of history at London University who had rendered many services to the workers, and it met with a powerful echo in the workshops of Paris, where the workers decided to send their answer to London in the hands of a special deputation. A meeting to welcome this French deputation took place in St. Martin's Hall, London, on the 28th of September, 1864, under the chairmanship of Professor Beazley. The hall was packed to the doors, and the English workers heard Tolaine read the answer of the French workers, which referred to the Polish insurrection in the words, "Once again Poland has been drenched with the blood of its best sons, and we were impotent spectators," and went on to demand that the voice of the people should be heard in all important political and social questions. The despotic power of capital must be broken. Owing to the division of labor, the worker had been turned into a mechanical tool, and free trade without international proletarian solidarity must develop into a form of industrial serfdom more merciless and more terrible than the serfdom which the great French Revolution had destroyed. The workers of the world must unite in order to offer stern resistance to such a terrible system. After a lively debate in which Icarius spoke on behalf of the German workers, the meeting adopted the proposal of the trade unionist Wheeler to elect a committee with the power of co-option, and to instruct it to draw up the statutes of an international workers' association to be enforced temporarily until an international congress to be held in Belgium the next year should decide finally on them. The committee was elected and